An armored hand tore the boy from Agnella's arms, and the child's cry struck the cobbles like a struck bell. Fear settled into the crowd as a physical thing. People pressed their shoulders against door frames, mothers shoved bowls under tables, and a man in the front row swallowed hard with a sound like gravel. The archivist stood 3 paces back under the elm, ledger clutched, and felt fear sharpen his fingers. That fear pushed him forward to record rather than to intervene. The archivist had been cataloguing municipal orders for 27 years. He kept the ledger with a brass clip and ink, stained gloves, and knew how a single decree could redirect a dozen lives. He stepped between 2 soldiers, not to stop them but to steady his notebook where ink would not smear, and watched Magistrate Lucero raise the wax seal. The crowd watched Lucero too. Some faces were blank, others already wet. Agnella's shawl slipped as she lunged. "Lucero, you cannot," she said, voice low and concrete, each word aimed at the magistrate's chest. "Lucero. My son has done nothing to your order." She used his name. The magistrate did not flinch. He tilted his head and folded the scroll. "Agnella." Lucero measured. "The law names the householders liable." Agnella's fingers found the soldier's sleeve and scraped. Her knuckles showed. "You take him and you take the bread from my children." The soldier shoved her hand away and the boy's small body went rigid in the man's arms. Within 5 sentences, the chapter's problem was plain. One accusation had become a public sentence on an entire household. The crowd understood the stakes without theory. Houses would be marked, fields would be seized, children would be turned into collateral. The archivist recorded the seal number and the margin note. He wrote with short, deliberate strokes. His motion was practical, not rhetorical. The ink formed letters that would be read by others who could act on them. The word that clung to him then was fear, that fear moved him to map patterns rather than to write pleas. He had seen edicts before, but never one that spelled out hereditary liability so plainly in its first clause. Thomas, the local scribe, came forward and held a lamp while Lucero signed. Thomas wore a threadbare coat and the smell of wet paper. Thomas, note the threshold mark." The archivist answered, "I will." Thomas's hand trembled as he stabled the lamp. His fingers left a smudge on the waxed paper. The lamp's light showed the seal and the curled script. The decree was nailed to the cottage and a circle was burned into the threshold with a hot iron. Soldiers forced Agnella to watch. They drove the nail through while the child clung to the hem of her skirt, and an old neighbor spat into the road. Lucero recited the statute in a low voice while the town clerk read the punishment aloud. The sentence was concrete. Loss of tenancy, public shaming, and designation of a child as collateral labor to the magistrate's chosen agent until restitution was paid. Agnella moved. She did not speak for a moment. She moved her hands as if arranging invisible things. She pushed her shawl higher and threaded both arms around the child. "Take me instead." Her line was simple and declarative. Lucero kept his face flat. "Agnella," he said, "the law is not retributive to a single body tonight. It's corrective across kinship." The phrasing read like ritual. Tension shifted. The crowd's curiosity became action. A neighbor, Marta the retired clerk, shouted, "Stand back." Marta's voice cut through the ritual cadence and forced Lucero to lift his head. Marta had known Lucero 30 years. She stepped forward with a bundle of old accounts under her arm and said, "You cannot apply that mark without record of precedent." Her line pressed at procedure. The archivist had been assigned to file the day's orders in the courthouse that evening. He left the green with the lamp oil still warm in his palm and the taste of smoke under his tongue. He walked with Thomas and Marta toward the courthouse, ink in his pocket and a ledger under his arm, and he felt the second emotion shift. From the immediate fear that had pushed him to record into a slow suspicion that something in the wording had been tailored. He tasted suspicion in the back of his throat. He cleared it and set a pace. They entered the courthouse archive under a low lintel where the scribe kept candles. The archivist opened the ledger and compared the new decree to those bound on the shelves. He ran a gloved finger along the spool of parchment and stopped at a marginal notation, a private signet beneath Lucero's public seal. The archivist's pen paused in the air. "Marta, you read that when you were clerk," he said. "Did you ever see Lucero's private signet recorded?" Marta's hand tightened on her bundle. "Not in public rolls," she said. "Not where I kept watch." Thomas crouched and peered at the binding. "This parchment is newer than the nails outside," he said. "The edge is trimmed." Someone shortened it. Thomas touched the margin with the tip of his lamp, and the seam flared. The archivist felt the next emotion shift, resolve. He moved with a new, pragmatic decision to verify the seal's origin and not to wait for a rumor to harden into policy. They pried open a damp cellar file beneath the archive where older bundles lay wrapped in oilcloth. Marta produced a burnt note she kept under her sleeve and ran the match across it. The cellar smelled of wet rope and onion. The archivist and Marta eased the seals and found older decrees. One named an unrelated household once punished in similar terms, and a second showed Lucero's wax matched a private loop not authorized by town council minutes. The handwriting in the margin indicated a clerk's shorthand that did not belong to the public register. A small mystery expanded into a discovery. The practice was not emergent from law alone. It had been shaped by one set of signatures. The archivist's pencil struck a strike, through where the public minutes had not been amended. That strike, through as a deliberate erasure. Outside, word moved faster than the courthouse lamp. By midnight, the tribunal chamber filled with townspeople who wanted to see procedure fulfilled, or to keep their distance, but not miss any change in custom. The chamber smelled of wax, boiled wool, and boiled cabbage. Lucero sat beneath a carved crest and tapped his signet against the desk. He wore his chain of office heavy and stiff. The chain made a soft metallic whisper when he moved. The archivist placed the ledger on a narrow side table and opened to the sealed page. He read passages aloud where necessary, his voice even, and when he read the clause that named the child as collateral, several people flinched audibly. Agnella sat with her hands clasped in her lap. Her jaw had a faint burn along it where an earlier labor accident had scarred the skin. That detail was concrete, and it made her look older than her years. "Lucero, the archivist, this margin shows your private seal applied to previous cases. Were those cases approved by the council?" Lucero's hand rested on the ceremonial dagger, though he kept it unused. The council sanctioned a broad reading. "I apply precedent where needed." His voice was cold and precise. Marta stepped forward and laid down a bundle of minutes. "Lucero," she said, "these minutes show no such sanction." The signatures are absent. Her voice did not tremble now. It cut. A rapid exchange followed. Lucero answered in short sentences meant to close space. Marta replied with 3 quick lines that forced him to justify procedure. Thomas read aloud an older docket. The debate rolled like a wheel. 3 to 6 quick lines back and forth as required when characters argue. The archivist recorded each named point in the ledger without commentary. The tribunal's tone hardened into a choice. Lucero pronounced a sentence that formalized the household's dispossession and specified the child be placed under an agent's care until restitution. The chamber echoed with a harsh intake of breath. Agnella rose and stepped in front of her child's small form. "I will not," she said, "take the man who accused him and return what you stole." Her words were direct and actionable. Lucero replied, "Order binds. You will be stripped of rights and duties until indemnity is paid." His face did not change. Agnella tried to move the scroll. She grabbed the edge. A soldier shoved her wrist, and the ring of her woven bracelet scraped metal. She tried to snatch the page and to tear it, an immediate attempt at erasure. The chamber erupted into motion. 2 soldiers seized her arms. The crowd hissed. The archivist leaned in and wrote, "Attempt to remove decree. Physical interference recorded." He wrote the detail like a legal witness. In the alley afterward, Agnella slipped onto the cottage roof with the child hidden beneath her skirt. She tapped the nailed notice until the iron warmed beneath her palm and tried to pry it loose. Her breath hitched. Her hands burned where the metal held. She worked the notice free with a small knife she had picked from a drawer. The action was frantic and precise. Her attempt lasted minutes. It ended when a neighbor spotted her movement and raised a cry. Soldiers poured into the alley. Agnella vaulted to the ground and ran toward the shed, pushing her shawl close. The child clung, lungs pounding. A soldier stepped out and took the child by the shoulder. Agnella lunged and was hauled backward. "Agnella!" The archivist shouted from the alley mouth, his ledger swinging at his hip. He moved forward, but 2 soldiers barred him with pikes. Thomas and Marta arrived breathless. Thomas's lamp skittered. Marta struck a hand against the soldier's forearm and said, "You called for restraint when I was clerk." Her name and plea cut through the soldiers' formation. Agnella's hands went slack when the child was carried away. She did not collapse into grief. She ground her jaw, set her shoulders, and breathed with a steadying motion meant to keep her focus. That physical steadiness expressed a change from panicked fear into stubborn endurance. The archivist recorded her attempt and marked the failed escape in the ledger as a distinct event. Back in his study at dawn, the archivist set the ledger open on the desk and drew the curtain aside to let a thin bar of sun fall on the page. He catalogued each motion: the sealed decree, the threshold mark, the burned notation, the private signet, the torn minutes. He laid them out in order and annotated names: Lucero, Agnella, Thomas, Marta. Each annotation was a decision to follow the pattern beyond a single household. He made a note to trace the agent who would receive the child. He found a lead. A wax residue on the decree that matched an agent's ledger held in the market quarter. The archivist planned a visit. He closed the brass spectacles on his nose and felt a new feeling emerge: grim clarity. The suspicion had hardened into a working hypothesis. The magistrate used private instruments to expand a punitive practice, and the town enforced it. That night Thomas came to the study with a small scrap of paper and a list of names. Lucero met with Sir Ald at dusk 3 weeks ago. Thomas, breathless. Sir Ald writes receipts in that ledger in the market. Thomas's voice was small and quick. Marta had left him a margin note in the courthouse. Checks of rent and payment that contradicted public rolls. The archivist underlined both names and said, "We go together." His words were a plan, not a vow. They approached Sir Ald's stall where leather hung and dried. Sir Ald was a broad man with a limp and a ledger on his bench. The archivist presented himself with his brass spectacles and said, "Sir Ald, I seek the agent's receipt for a child's placement noted under Lucero's signet." Sir Ald looked up, measured the archivist with a single blink, and then shut the ledger with a hand that left a grease mark. "We have no child named in my book tonight," he said. "Marta, Sir Ald, the ledger shows a transfer 90 days ago." She produced a scrap and laid it on his counter. Sir Ald's hand went to his mouth. He hesitated. "Marta," he said, "you name things that pull me into trouble." His voice was raw and immediate. The archivist continued, "We will note a public inspection on Friday. Bring your ledger, Sir Ald." He set a date that required action. At the public inspection, a small surprise occurred. A clerk produced a ledger page that did not match Sir Ald's handwriting. The strokes were different and the ink matched Lucero's private loop. The crowd murmured. "Lucero, clerks make errors." Marta tapped a finger against the page and replied, "Errors do not create marginal private seals." The archivist pointed to the loop and read it aloud. For a moment Lucero's composure slipped. He inhaled and answered in short, measured sentences designed to close the space of accusation. Marta fired back 3 direct lines that demanded a council hearing. Thomas read older entries aloud. The exchange pushed Lucero to call for order, then a twist. A widow named Isella, whom the archivist had not expected to speak, produced a letter she had kept under a floorboard. In plain handwriting she had copied a conversation where Lucero her to sign a parchment without reading it and promised leniency for her neighbor if she complied. The archivist inspected the letter and found the same private loop on the bottom corner where Lucero's hand had touched the paper to steady it. Isella's testimony changed what the crowd believed. The archivist's ledger noted the letter as a turning point. The town council convened the following morning. Lucero defended the practice as precedent. Marta pressed for a public audit. Agnella arrived with a small group of women who had known the child since infancy. They did not shout, but they formed a pressed line of witnesses. The council voted to review the minutes and to strike a temporary hold on similar sentences until verification. The archivist watched Lucero's face as the vote happened. Lucero's jaw clenched and a vein rose on his temple. He kept his hands still. Despite the temporary hold, the child's fate did not reverse in a single moment. Sir Ald's ledger stayed closed until an inspection produced a corrected page. The child's transfer, once traced, revealed payments that had been routed through a shell tenancy. The archivist wrote each lead and the money trail. Each entry narrowed the question of motive. A small confrontation closed the chapter's immediate conflict. Lucero met Marta in the council anteroom and said in low, clipped lines, "You accuse me publicly and you risk the town's order." Marta replied, 3 lines quick and sharp, I risk my name because I prefer names that can be read, they argued until a clerk insisted on silence. The archivist recorded the exchange and underlined the point where procedure could force a formal reprimand. By dawn, the archivist returned to the green where the family's cottage stood dark and bare. The nailed notice still hung, its iron black with rain. He set his ledger on the windowsill and wrote the last line for the chapter. The child had been placed with Sir Ald under a conditional receipt, the household had been stripped of tenancy, and the public hold required further audit. He closed the ledger and left the page open at the margin he would trace next. Agnella stood at the cottage door when he left. She did not beg. She held the locket at her chest and watched him go. If you find the truth, tell them who took my boy, the archivist replied. I will write it down and I will follow the marks. His voice was steady. The chapter ends not with consolation but with a concrete action. The archivist marking a new line in his ledger and setting a time to inspect council minutes. He pushed his spectacles up, pocketed the pen, and walked toward the courthouse steps, where Thomas and Marta were waiting with a small pile of pages. The ledger's page was damp at the corner where a night had leaked in. He slid it under a brass clip and set the next seal to follow. The final sentence in the chapter is a record. He wrote the child's name, the agent's receipt date, and Lucero's private loop, and then he snapped the ledger shut. A constable's boot struck the cradle and the infant began to howl before the wax seal could be read. Defiance pushed Agnella forward. She loosed her grip on the shawl and shoved against the constable's shoulder. You cannot take him, she said, voice low, nails leaving dirt in the man's sleeve. Men with iron buckles stepped over the threshold and set a folded parchment on the table like a verdict already done. Within moments the lane filled. Women dragged children into doorways. A cart rattled up as two scribes unrolled a sheet of parchment. Agnella reached for the paper. Her hand trembled not from fear but from a decision pressing against her ribs. The central problem was immediate. A single accusation had become a household sentence. The law demanded the family's goods and the family's dignity. She knew the mechanics of such decrees. Years earlier a warrant had taken her boy from the market, and a soldier had carried him off inside the crowd. She had tried to pull him back then. The memory was a specific H. The strap burning across her palm where an armored hand had closed around the child's jacket. The incident aloud now, naming the man in the market, and the crowd answered with a sound like a struck bell, half anger, half resignation. A scribe read the clause aloud, mouth dry, letters falling like small stones. The parchment named the accused and then spelled its reach. Kin servants, household produce, livestock. The constable who held the cradle repeated, by order of the magistrate. Agnella grabbed the infant and thrust the child to her chest, head tucked under her chin. She did not shout. She breathed in and let the breath form a decision, emotion root, defiance, that impulse shaped every motion. She would not watch her family listed and stacked on a cart without fighting. She was not a woman who struck men in the street for sport. She had kept a household, mended a roof, soon children's hems. Now those tasks turned into a battleground. Agnella pushed a bowl into the constable's free hand. Take surface bowls, she said. Leave the cooking cauldron. It belongs to the neighbors while my children sleep. The constable blinked and looked to his captain. The captain signaled, and two men began to load pottery and a battered chest onto the cart. A neighbor, Marin, stepped forward and signed a small sheet the scribe proffered, his fingers shaking. The public inventory started like a ritual. Agnella watched the cart fill. She counted each item as if it were a child. She saw the brass locket she had hidden beneath her shirt and the burn along her jaw, both small. Private facts that now had to be handed over or hidden at cost. When the scribe read that signatures would cement legal erasure, several villagers shuffled closer. Some signed without looking up. Others hid their faces. One man, old Reinald the baker, spat on the ground and refused. I will not sign a lie, he said, Agnella his name. Reinald looked at her. Reinald, she said, and he nodded. Reinald, then write what you saw. Tell them the boy was taken from the market by a patron's men. Tell the truth. Reinald waved a flower, dusted hand and offered a single sentence that the scribe scratched down. The scribe's pen paused. Agnella's chest tightened. The inventory by design made private loss into public shame. The cart made visible what the law could take. The crowd, compelled witnesses and casual onlookers, became a tribunal by attendance alone. By late morning, Magistrate Lucero assembled a bench. The courthouse smelled of wax and oiled leather. Lucero climbed the dais with a chain of office clinking against his robe. He read from registry and precedent in a voice measured enough to hurt. He justified collective punishment as order. A household bound to a single crime ensured deterrence, cleared suspicion, and preserved hierarchies. His hands never trembled. His eyes surveyed the room as one reads a map. Agnella stepped up when her name was called. She kept her shoulders forward. Her voice was low. "Magistrate Lucero," she said, "you know my son. He cannot be bound for another man's debt." Lucero inclined his head. "Agnella," he said, "you understand the law. The registry is clear. If the neighbor's oath is false, that is a matter for petition. Today we enforce the decree while petitions proceed." "A petition written by whom?" she asked. "Whom do I petition if the man who accused my son is the magistrate's patron?" There was a silence long enough for a clerk to cough. Agnella's doubt made a small noise inside her ribs. Defiance shifted into doubt. She studied Lucero's face and found no flinch. He folded both hands and drummed the edge of a sealed scroll. "We follow precedent, Lucero. Precedent keeps the peace." Agnella's reply was a physical act. She unfolded her shawl and held the brass locket out on the palm of her hand. The token had belonged to her husband. It was not evidence, it was a statement. Several townspeople leaned forward. She left the tribunal with a private summons to Lucero's chamber at early afternoon. The room smelled colder. A single candle guttered on the table. Lucero closed the door and spoke without standing. "Agnella," he said, "I will offer conditional mercy. One life given in exile will spare the rest. Choose a member of your household to leave this county at dawn and swear never to return. The record will be amended for those who remain." She heard the transaction in his words. Order preserved at the cost of a life. The moral calculus of officials laid plain. Defiance hardened into calculation and then into a new fear. That any choice would cost them a body. "Who will you give? Lucero, who will you send?" Agnella clenched her fist until the knuckles whitened. She thought of the boy and of the eldest daughter, of her aged mother. She thought of the neighbor who had refused to sign and of the scribe's flinch when Reinald's line appeared on the registry. She thought of the cost of exile in winter. Memory shifted into a bargaining ledger. Names, ages, skills, debts. She heard her own breath loud in the small room. Before she answered, a constable who had remained outside slipped a folded scrap across the chamber table. The constable's hand trembled. He kept his eyes down. "Marco," the constable said, and Marco's mouth flattened. The scrap was a single line and a name. It named the patron who had arranged the accusation. The registry entries, it said, had been altered. Agnella's breath stopped. Doubt moved into sudden clarity. She read the scrap aloud under her breath. Lucero's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. He did not rise. The scribe who had stood outside the door, Reinald had told the scribe to watch, entered, face shaded, and dropped a small bundle of documents on the table. The revelation shifted the room. What had been a clean legal transaction now showed cracks. The law's claim to moral authority thinned when forgery appeared among its ledgers. Agnella felt hope and a new fear at once. Hope offered a thin path to undo the decree. Fear warned that any attempt to expose the forgery would be met with swifter reprisal. Emotion shifted. Defiance, doubt, clarity, fear. Agnella took a second course. She did not roar, she did not faint. She moved as she had always moved, by gathering people and making them do a single thing together. She went to the market and touched each sleeve and each countertop. She spoke to women who had stood at laundry tubs, to men who had bartered fish, to the apprentice smith who could copy a signature. She one sentence at each stop. "Sign with me if you saw them take him. Write what you saw." The coalition assembled quietly. The scribe who had slipped into Lucero's chamber, named Reinald, the baker's son, brought a second pen. Marco the constable moved among pockets and doorways, bringing witnesses out of hiding. The group met in a tavern backroom under the guise of a will, reading. They moved fast. Each action produced friction. At the market, one woman, Selma, whispered, "If we refuse, they'll take our cart's neck." She looked to Agnella. "Agnella, I will sign." "I saw them take a boy into the market crush. I will sign." Selma's line was a small human proof. Others came forward. The scribe wrote lines in a cramped hand and nailed dates to the margin. The coalition collected signatures, sworn statements, and a witness who could place the patron's men in the market at the time of the initial arrest. Agnella's plan matured into a public strategy: expose forgery at the tribunal with a chorus of witnesses. The action was precise. The aim was to force Lucero to account for the altered registry in public. She moved through the night piecing statements together. She instructed the apprentice Smith to copy the patron's seal for comparison. Every small task was a pledge. At dusk the group marched to the courthouse. They did not bring torches, they brought evidence. They filed up the courthouse steps. Inside, Lucero sat on his dais, the same chain of office weighing his robe. Constables lined the room like stakes. Agnella held the bundle of papers. Her voice did not shake. "Magistrate Lucero," she said, "I have signatures. I have witness lines. I have the note naming the patron. This registry is false." Lucero's reply was a slow tilt of the head. "You cannot present forged documents and expect the bench to overturn a decree. We hold order by the records." Agnella's ally Reinald stepped forward and placed his hand on the table. "Reinald saw the men by the river," he said. Reinald signed, "Because I would not lie." The scribe at the bench tapped the parchment with a quill. "Read them, Lucero. One document does not undo precedent." At that moment the constables moved. One reached for Reinald. The room bristled. Agnella pushed between the constable and the witness. "You will not take him, not now." Her hand was a furniture of force against the constable's chest. Words turned to shoves. A scuffle broke out. Men seized wrists. A child in the gallery began to cry. Lucero rose and called order. "Order!" he said, and his voice carried over the din like a hammer. He signaled the constables to remove the witnesses. The magistrate's face, set and ceremonial, sank into a small, strategic rage. A rapid exchange followed. 3 to 6 quick lines of argument between Agnella and Lucero. "You forged their names." "Agnella, you cannot stand on forged paper." "Prove it," Lucero replied. "Show your proof here in court. Look at the seal." "Reinald, it does not match. The seal belongs to a patron outside our jurisdiction." "Lucero, and yet the document bears our hand." "Then whose hand wrote the margin?" Agnella demanded. "Whose hand changed the ledger?" "We will review procedure." "Lucero, you will leave this hall until procedure runs its course." The exchange ended with constables arresting 2 men who had shouted the loudest. Agnella felt the room close like a trap. The clerk yanked one witness out by a sleeve. An ally was dragged past her feet. Outside the courthouse steps, dusk turned to a brittle quiet. Some documents were amended as a token. Lucero offered a partial concession. A minor ledger correction here, a promise to investigate there. The cart's load remained distributed among neighboring households. A few families recovered small things. Others were left marked. Agnella watched the partial amendment. She watched Lucero sign in a cramped hand and hand the altered paper to the scribe. The public restitution was paper thin. She felt the sting of small mercy and the cold of incomplete justice. Back in the lane, neighbors muttered. A child pressed a fist to her mouth. Marco the constable touched Agnella's arm. "You were brave," he said, "but the magistrate will not forget this." Agnella did not answer with words. She moved through the village making certain small repairs. A mended hem, a replaced nail in a shutter, a whispered instruction to the apprentice to hide certain tools. Each act was a practical attempt to preserve life. She handed the amended registry to Reinald and asked him to copy a duplicate and hide it beneath the baker's floorboards. He nodded and did so. The narrator, who had recorded these events in a ledger later catalogued in dim rooms, writes of the result without ornament. The tribunal issued a partial performative resolution. Some papers were amended. A token mercy was granted. Several families remained marked. Agnella carried a new burden and an uncertain promise of retribution. The village learned which names to avoid. Shops shifted where goods were left. The children who had witnessed the seizure grew quieter. Lucero returned to his ceremonial posture and restored the registry's outward shape. Inside, the ledger retained its stains. Outside, a small group of families plotted quiet ways to survive the new precedent. Agnella sat on the courthouse steps and counted the signatures again from memory. She could list the 5 names who had refused to help, the 7 who had signed too quickly, the dozen who had hidden their faces. She knew who had helped and who had looked away. She clenched a paper between her fingers until the edges creased. In the final moment of the day, when the candlelight on the steps leaned toward dusk, someone handed Agnella a folded, official-looking paper. It was not the amended registry. It was a summons, a notice that the magistrate reserved the right to review any household for 2 years. The legal mark would linger longer than any temporary mercy. She stood and tucked the summons into her shawl. Her hands smelled of wax and ink. The sounds of the market thinned. She walked past the cart, now half empty, and set down a small pot of beans she had kept for her children. She did this in public, not as penance but as practical economy. The pot would feed them tonight. She did not speak of defiance now. She acted. The chapter closes on a concrete beat. At dusk, Agnella looks back once and slides the amended page into the cracks beneath the bakery floor while the baker, Reinald, looks on and secures the board with 2 nails. She leaves the courthouse steps with the summons in her shawl and a list of names in her head. The ledger will hold the record. The village will remember who signed and who did not. The law has marked households. The immediate conflict resolved into a brittle settlement. But the consequences will carry forward as proof in the magistrate's ledgers and as caution in the mouths of neighbors. Armored constables hauled sacks and a wailing child onto the platform while Agnella lunged forward and struck the nearest man's breastplate with both palms. Fear sat between her shoulder blades and pushed her forward. Fear told her hands to seize, to shield, to make a human barrier where law and ritual wanted an empty cradle. The crowd closed like a hinge, voices rose and flattened. The constable shoved at Agnella's shoulder. "Agnella, stand back." One barked, "You know the decree." Agnella answered by trying to step between the child and the men. She had seen this before. A month earlier, an armored hand had torn the boy from her arms, the same boy now wailing. And a constable's boot had struck the cradle until splinters flecked the cobbles. That memory arrived as sight and sound. Leather rasp, child's breath scattering, the shawl slipping from Agnella's shoulder. Fear, the root of her motion, had shifted already once into fury that day when she had shoved the constable and left a crescent bruise on his sleeve. Now, on the platform at dawn, fear pushed into a different shape, anger sharpened into defiance. The magistrate moved up the steps with his chain of office catching the first weak light. Lucero's face was set. His robe carried the weight of ceremony and the smell of stale incense. He did not hurry. He always made people wait so that his arrival read like inevitability. Agnella watched him and, despite the danger, counted on 2 things she had learned about him. He favored precedent and spectacle. If she could force a choice in front of the crowd, she could force him to enact spectacle rather than quietly fold the law into profit. The first sentences on the scroll were ceremonial and precise. The scribe read. His voice was flat and even, by precedent and by law. The household of Terra Agnella is struck. Goods forfeit, kin stripped of protection, offspring subject to custody under the crown's interest. Agnella heard each word snap like a bone. The crowd caught the sound and folded it into a sharp silence. Her fingers tightened on the fringe of her shawl. Neighbors looked away. 2 women near the stall opposite tugged their children closer, eyes avoiding Agnella's face. When the decree moved into specifics, the scribe's young hand faltered. He paused, inked the nib, and put a marginal note beside a clause. The note was small. A narrower reading where the law could be interpreted to limit seizure to the accused's own goods, not to the whole households. That hesitation was the first fracture in the public ritual. Lucero saw the motion and said nothing. He let the crowd see the scribe falter. He let the crowd wait. Agnella felt a shift. Fear became a tight, practical calculation. If the scribe's note could be used, she would not only plead. She would make the law contradict the performance. Magistrate Lucero, Agnella called out, voice low and steadier than she felt. That steadiness was action. It was a choice to speak. Lucero read what the scribe wrote. She stepped onto the platform and each footfall scraped the packed earth. Voices around her cried out. Agnella, no, remember the law. Let them do their work. The constables tightened the line. Lucero lifted a hand. His face registered annoyance, then something like calculation. The law is clear, Agnella. Your kin bear the stain of kinship to a criminal. The city cannot tolerate contagion of lawlessness. His words were measured. The crowd absorbed them without needing to translate. Agnella's pulse knocked at the same pace as the town crier's bell. The scribe looked up, young and pale, ink smudged at thumb and forefinger. Read it plainly. Agnella read the marginal note aloud, her voice cut over the hum. She named the scribe. Scribe Thomas read it. Thomas swallowed and his jaw worked. He leaned closer to the decrees. He read the marginal note aloud, words small but clear. Whereas law speaks of goods and persons connected by blood, precedent constrains execution of household sequestration to cases where direct collusion can be proven. There was a murmur, an audible intake, like wind through a half-open door. Several men in the front row exchanged looks. Among them, a merchant named Bertie, whose stall had been robbed by the same men now hauling Agnella's pots, spit into the gutter. The scribe's note had given a new hinge to the day. For a moment the ritual broke, and the law looked like a tool that could be pried and turned. Lucero's hands tightened on his decree. He stepped down from the platform and set his face close to Thomas's. "You would make a mockery of custom," he said, each syllable deliberate. "You would tell the people their magistrates have no teeth." His voice sharpened. The crowd's silence froze into attention. Agnella felt the second shift, defiance flowering into dread. If Lucero pushed back hard, the cost would land on her household immediately. Agnella reached into her pocket and fumbled for the one brass locket she never let go. Her fingers found it and clutched. That small act was a signal. It steadied her enough to speak again, then let the law decide. Lucero. Let the witnesses be called. Let the instruments of trade be listed in public. Let the merchants of the square speak on our behalf. Her sentences were clipped. She named the merchants by sight and habit. She invoked the tangible tools, animals, accounts, and the crowd responded to such concrete claims. Lucero's reply came cold and swift. "The law will be judged here, not in stalls. The crown's order stands. Sit down, Agnella." Submit. He used the word submit with that ceremonial softness that aims to make resistance look improper. Around them, some townspeople nodded. Others, who had once received meat or bread from Agnella's cooking, only watched with faces that had learned how to look out for themselves. Neighbors began to file through the family's dwelling as men with hooks, and ledger clerks moved into every room. The shift was immediate and physical. Tools vanished from hearths, a goat was led away by the collar, a chest of patterned cloth was unlatched and taken. Agnella followed them, each step a sentence of protest. She found a neighbor, Marta, at the doorway, hands white, knuckled on the lintel. "Marta, Agnella, help me mark what's ours." Marta's voice was a small breach. "Agnella, I can't. They'll take what they see. I had 2 coins stolen last week. I cannot cross them now." Agnella watched the constable hook a plough and heave it onto a cart. The plough's iron rung against the cart's wood. The sound cut like a small, private alarm. At the platform edge, Agnella tried to tear the waxed seal from the decree. She shoved forward and felt fingers close around her wrist. "You cannot touch the magistrate's writ," a constable hissed. Agnella tore and the wax cracked. Someone laughed. The laugh had no warmth. Agnella's desperation rose, and with it a quick, raw exchange of words. "Let go of my arm," she said. "Let go or I will scream for every man who remembers how you took my boy." The constable answered with a push and a hand at the back of her neck. The crowd recoiled at the scuffle but did not surge to help. 3 constables hauled her to the cobbles, cuffing her wrists with rough hemp rope. In the same motion, they unlatched the cradle and carried the child away. Agnella reached, nails scraping leather, and the child's toes curled within the blanket. The crowd made no move to stop them. Some turned their heads. Some watched with the convenience of bystanders measuring risk. Bertie offered no help. The magistrate watched from above and set his decree down with a sound like a bell striking a bone. He pronounced the final clause with a mocked gentleness. By order, the household stands sentenced, property seized, kin bound to the custody of the crown. The law is effectual. This moment, the ceremonial finality, was the chapter's apex. The crowd inhaled and exhaled in the same rhythm as the constables locking heavy chains to the family's door. Chains rang. A mother in the second row gave a single keening cry and then stilled. Agnella, cuffed and hauled to her feet, met the magistrate's gaze. He seemed satisfied, as if the day's performance had reaffirmed him. The scribe's marginal note lay unread on the table, ink still wet at the corner. While they led the family away, the ledger clerks completed inventories under quick, official hands. Names were struck from civic lists. A neighbor, Rano, stepped aside and tucked the child's blanket into his coat with 2 fingers. His eyes darted like a man who had chosen a small rebellion. He did not stay to be seen. Someone else closed the shutters on the opposite store. The merchant's silence was a choice as loud as a shout. By late afternoon, Agnella's dwelling was emptied of what the law permitted. A scribe counted and wrote. A constable loaded a cart with pots and a battered wooden cradle. The air smelled of horse sweat and stale parchment. Agnella's shawl had dragged on the cobbles until it bore mud streaks. She watched each object as if they were pages being stripped from a book of her life. Inside the magistrate's chamber that evening, Lucero sat with a small cluster of officials, and the ledger of confiscations open between them. He smoothed the page and summoned paper to be signed. He smiled at one of the clerks when a profitable account appeared. The smile was narrow and the kind that counts coins before it counts conscience. A scribe in the corner, Thomas, had a different look. His fingers trembled over the ink, and he kept glancing at his marginal note as if it were an accusation. Thomas could not let it go. When Lucero stepped out to receive a tie of praise from a visiting magistrate, Thomas moved closer to the open ledger and placed a second marginal mark. A notation that the earliest seized goods included items clearly inventory, marked for resale to officials. It was an allegation threaded in ink, a record of improper appropriation. Thomas scrawled the name of a merchant who had been seen quarreling with the constables the week before. His hand shook, but the words were legible. That small act altered the balance. It did not overturn the public sentence on the platform, but it created a different kind of consequence. The magistrate now faced the possibility of internal scrutiny, the sort that eats away at ceremony from within. Thomas took the note to the archivist that night. The archivist, who kept the city's long ledgers and who had the steady, methodical voice everyone called in to catalogue cruelty without moralizing, read the marginalia and put the thin sheet into his own leather-bound volume. The archivist's move was quiet and precise. He did not issue proclamations. He did not call for uprisings. He set the page beneath a brass press and wrote a formal summary that he would later tape into a hidden margin. He recorded names, receipts, and the time of removal. His ledger did what the platform could not. It preserved a record where performance had only shadowed a law that ate whole families. That cataloging felt like a small justice to him, not redemption but documentation. In the weeks that followed, life in the square adjusted around the absence of Agnella's household. Stalls that once flew banners now hung plain cloth. The mother who had cried at the platform started bringing bread at night to houses she had never crossed before. The child taken that morning did not appear in the public rolls. A patched blanket was found at Rano's hearth, and a note tucked into its seam read only. For now, who had left it was a question asked, and not answered in the same breath. Agnella sat some nights in a cell beneath the watchtower. They allowed her a corner to sleep and a rough bowl for food. When they unbound her wrists to wash them, her hands were calloused and raw. She learned to count the knots of rope by touch and to read the jailer's idiosyncrasies. Once when the jailer unlocked the door to bring water, he grunted and said, "Lucero says how well the city sings when the law moves straight." Agnella only replied, "Lucero sings for those with coins." The rest of us hum for food, it was said without flourish. It landed as a fact. Inside the magistrate's office, the ledger that Thomas had marked became evidence, quietly circulated beneath other pages. At first only the archivist and a hatchet-faced clerk named Varro saw it. Varro had a ledger of his own, one that tracked payments and deliveries. When he compared the dates, he found that livestock and grain had been routed through a nearby warehouse controlled by a deputy who traded in seized goods. Varro swore once under his breath and then brought the notes to Thomas. This was a second small crack. The two men, Thomas and Varro, argued in low, urgent tones in the stairwell outside the magistrate's chamber. "If Lucero smells this, he'll set us aside, Varro. If we do nothing, he'll sell the excuse of law and eat the city." Thomas looked at his own hands and then at Varro. "We cannot write nothing," he said. "We must put the entries where paper cannot be brushed away." They agreed to do what the archivist had done. Record, index, hide. Agnella's own arc reached its final turn on a chill afternoon when she was brought before the lesser council for a final accounting. They had tied the child's name to property seizure and to the stain of kinship. Agnella had been given no formal time to prepare. She wore the same shawl with the faint burn along her jaw that marked a boy's accident years earlier. Standing in the council room, she felt fear return, then shift into a shaped anger that directed her speech. "Magistrate Lucero," she said directly, when given a small chance to speak. The room threaded silent. "You make law and call it mercy. You take what ploughs feed and call it prevention. But there are receipts, there are names. You took my child's cradle, and you declared my family criminal. Where did the pots go? Which deputy sold them?" Her voice did not quake. She used the names the town would expect. The deputy's warehouse, Rano's stall, the ledger clerk's shortened. Her accusations were concrete, aimed at precise facts, not at ceremony. Lucero's reply was a measured dismissal. "You will find the law sufficient, Agnella. The council has made its determination." He spoke to the whole room. He did not look for a fight. He offered the kind of calm that closes arguments. But the council clerk, Varro, who had seen the hidden notes Thomas hid with the archivist, coughed and produced a folded piece of paper from his sleeve. He laid it on the table. The folded sheet held an index, dates and shipments, signatures that matched a deputy's mark and small notations that matched the magistrate's own seals. The room shifted. Argue as Lucero might, the concrete markings on paper showed an alternate route. Officials profiting from the seizure. Someone at the back, a merchant whose name Agnella had invoked on the platform, rose up and said, "My sack was taken last month, and 2 days later that same sack was sold at the deputy's yard." The voice trembled, but it was a factual claim. The council looked at Lucero. He went white, and then, as men in power do, he blinked and found the next ceremony, a call for an inquiry. The inquiry was slow and precise. It did not restore Agnella's child or the cradle that had been cracked on the cobbles. It did not instantly release the seized pots or undo the social ostracism that had left her with fewer customers and fewer allies. But the formal records began to name names. Deputies were summoned. A few small returns were ordered. The public sentence stood in its formal wording. But pockets of the confiscated goods came back to households when an elder clerk traced receipts and tempered some of the seizures. Agnella watched these returns with a mixture of numbness and a concrete gratitude that had no language of epiphany. When a pot was placed back on a shelf, she ran her hand along its rim to confirm it was the same dented copper. She spoke to neighbors not in rhetoric but in requests. "Fetch the cloth from the loft, Marta. Count the bowls with me." Her life adjusted in small measures as objects came back into her hands. Even as the inquiry moved, Lucero's prestige started to rot at the seams. Not all his allies stuck. A wax-sealed messenger arrived to remove the magistrate's ceremonial dagger from his collection for safekeeping. Rumors of misappropriation make men cautious. The public, who had watched ceremony prefer precedent over mercy, now watched clerks and ledgers confirm private profit. Lucero stepped down from certain posts and kept the rest. He did not leave town, nor was he dragged to the stocks. He learned the slow, corrosive art of compromise. Keep enough authority to stay in place. Surrender enough so the rest will not rise. Agnella's own final movement was quieter than a mob and harder in the way that lasts. She did not storm the magistrate. She did not give speeches. She reclaimed what she could and, more importantly, she rebuilt how the square knew her. She resumed a stall with a single cooking pot and sold stew by the bowl. When people bought, she did not lecture them. She used names. "Bertie, your son eats too fast. Rano, your wife asked for extra barley." She wove back into the city's fabric through named, useful acts. Her defiance had shifted again into a practical endurance that made survival its own statement. The archivist continued his own work. He had recorded the marginalia and the names. He had indexed them under a heading that would not be printed in public reports. He kept the page that Thomas had added and the ledger where Varro had penciled receipts. He catalogued the names of neighbors who helped hide the child. He wrote the entries plainly: dates, names, items, actions. His final act in the chapter was a concrete one. He closed the leather-bound ledger and slid the sealed tolly beneath the final entry. That closed an immediate bureaucratic circle. It did not heal the hurt, but it made truth persistent in wood and thread. At night, Agnella sat on the back step of her small repaired stall and counted the returns. 3 pots, 1 blanket, a single goat from a benefactor who preferred anonymity. When the constable who had struck the cradle walked by, he did not meet her eyes. She gave him nothing. She said nothing. Instead, she tied a new knot in a rope that held her stall's awning. That roof would shelter trade the next morning. She wrapped the child's returned blanket around her shoulders and felt its roughness anchor her. The city did not become different overnight. Some neighbors still turned their faces away, but the ledger now recorded names that could no longer be casually erased. The final concrete beat came in the archivist's study when he sat at his table and copied out the day's entries into a separate, smaller book intended for private readers among a small network. He pressed the quill down, closed the loop on a letter, and then, deliberately, he set the smaller book into a satchel and locked it. He slid the satchel into a shelf behind other volumes and closed the door of the study. That action, lock, place, conceal, was not melodramatic. It was a small, resolute insertion of truth into the city's memory. Agnella felt the resolution less as triumph than as a rebalancing of immediate harms. Her child was not fully safe. The child's days would be split between hands that sheltered and eyes that watched. Lucero retained enough power to continue in life, but the ledger's ink had stung him in a way that would cost him favors. The merchants who had helped recover goods had reputations he knew. The scribe Thomas learned to steady his hand. He worked mornings now at the archivist's side, copying entries and learning how to make paper speak the truth. The day the ledger received its brass tally, Agnella walked once more to the platform. She did not shout. She stood at the edge and pushed her shawl back, lifted the crank of her stall, and set a single bowl of stew on the step for anyone who needed it. Bertie stepped forward, made a small nod, and left 2 coins on the bowl's rim. Rano slipped a folded blanket back into the child's cloth sleeve and did not speak. The magistrate watched from his window and turned away. The final sentence of the chapter is not a tidy moral. It is a list of small actions that, when combined, change how the city remembers what happened. A scribe's marginal note, clerk's folded receipt, the archivist's sealed tally, a neighbor's hidden blanket, a pot returned to a shelf, a stall reopened. A child sheltered under someone else's roof. Agnella's fear had guided her into action. That fear became defiance, then dread, then practical endurance. Her arc ended with work and naming, and the slow recovery of objects and some dignity. In the dim study, the archivist set the ledger back on its shelf, closed the leather cover, and slid the sealed tally beneath the final entry. He made no announcement. He did not promise justice. He only did what he had always done. He recorded who had been harmed and how the town had acted, and he made sure the record would not be erased by ceremony alone. The last sound in the room was the soft click of the brass seal sliding into place, a concrete echo that would remain where speeches had been emptied into the square. Outside, in the lanes that led away from the market, someone left a child's blanket at Rano's door and a small scrap of paper pinned to it. For now, it was not a grand finish, but it was an action connected to the day on the platform. A family disrupted, a magistrate checked, a ledger written, and neighbors who had chosen to shelter a child. The chapter closed on that small, precise movement. The crowd dispersed, the platform remained, the names stayed on paper, the consequences were counted in receipts and returned bowls, and Agnella set her hand to the stall's awning, pulled it taut, and drove a peg into the earth, a simple, necessary act that anchored what had been left.